Look at her hands. She is moving without hesitation, pressing the heel of her palm into the dough, her knuckles reading it like a language. She doesn't measure the flour. She hasn't measured it in 40 years. She knows by the weight, by how it falls, by some inherited understanding between her palms and the cold morning air. She is 68 years old, and she has been doing this since she was 9. The girl beside her, her daughter, or maybe her granddaughter, is watching. She seems polite about it, patient, but she isn't writing it down, isn't asking questions. And something about the distance between them, some quiet negotiation neither one can name, means the knowledge will stay in those hands and go no further. This is not a story about a recipe. This is not a story about thrift. This is the story of an entire body of knowledge earned through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through immigration and grief, and seasons when there simply was not enough, that was quietly, tenderly, deliberately allowed to disappear. And the question that haunts every kitchen in this story is the one almost no one thought to ask at the time. Why did women stop teaching their daughters the very skills that had kept their families alive? Because sometimes what a family chooses to forget says as much about them as what they choose to remember. Chapter 1. The wisdom no one wrote down. There is a particular kind of knowledge that doesn't live in books. It lives in a movement, in a smell, in the feel of a heel of bread pressed between 2 fingers to test its age, in the look of lard when it's ready to set, in the exact amount of water you need to stretch yesterday's soup into today's dinner, a quantity that no one has ever measured, because measuring it would mean writing it down, and writing it down would mean believing it needed to be preserved. The survival knowledge carried by poor and working-class American women through the first half of the 20th century was almost never formally recorded, and that was not by accident. These women learned by watching, and they taught by being watched. The transmission was physical, entirely oral. A daughter stood beside her mother at a wood stove and absorbed, without being told she was absorbing, a language of scarcity, the grammar of getting through. This knowledge moved in specific channels, mother to daughter, aunt to niece, neighbor to neighbor over a back fence or a shared clothesline. But it also moved through networks that have largely been forgotten today. By the early 20th century, the USDA's Cooperative Extension Service, established under the Smith-Lever Act of 1914, was sending trained home economists directly into rural farmhouses to demonstrate canning, food preservation, and household management. These women, called demonstration agents, carried tested practical knowledge to families who would otherwise have relied entirely on informal transmission. In some counties, they were among the only educated women that isolated farm families encountered all year. They arrived on horseback, then by automobile, carrying canning jars and printed bulletins, teaching women to seal tomatoes safely, to dry beans correctly, to preserve what the summer gave them against the certainty of winter. In immigrant communities, something similar happened through mutual aid societies. Eastern European, Italian, Jewish, and Mexican-American women belonged to informal networks that shared not just money and food in times of crisis, but knowledge, the specific, unglamorous knowledge of how to feed 8 people on what a more comfortable household would have thrown away. And what was that knowledge exactly? It was, at its heart, a language for transforming almost nothing into something. It was the ability to look at a bare larder and see possibility rather than lack. It was frugality not as a condition, but as an art, practiced daily, passed hand to hand, and almost never spoken of, because you didn't need to speak of what everyone around you already knew. But before we explore what these women actually knew, there is something important to understand about who they were, because this wasn't a small, quiet group living at the margins of American life. This wisdom was, at its height, practically universal, and almost none of their daughters learned it. Chapter 2. What getting by actually looked like. Let's be honest about what surviving on very little actually required. It required knowing that a single chicken was not a meal. It was 4 or 5 meals, sometimes more. The bird was roasted on Sunday. The leftover meat stretched into Monday soup. The carcass, simmered long and slow, produced a stock so rich it would gel solid overnight in the icebox. The fat skimmed from that stock was saved in a jar beside the stove, available for frying, for basting, for spreading on bread when there was nothing else. The feet were added to the pot too, for the collagen they carried. Nothing was wasted that could be used. The practice of saving cooking fats, the rendered residue of bacon, of pork belly, of whatever animal fat the house could afford, was so deeply embedded in American domestic life that during the Second World War, the Office of Price Administration ran nationwide campaigns asking women to bring their saved kitchen drippings to local butchers. The fat was collected, processed, and turned into glycerin for munitions production. Women were already doing it. The government simply redirected what was already there. Most of these households owned exactly what they needed and used exactly what they owned. Clothing was not replaced when it wore out. It was mended. When mending could no longer hold, the garment was repurposed. Worn sheets were turned sides to middle. The center of the sheet, where bodies had worn it thin, was cut out, and the two stronger outer edges were stitched together, producing a usable sheet from one that had seemed finished. Worn shirts became patches. Patches became rags. Rags became stuffing, or braided rugs, or kindling. Nothing disappeared until it could truly be reduced no further. In the rural South, and across many immigrant communities, children wore clothing sewn from the cotton sacks in which flour and animal feed were sold. The practice was so widespread that by the 1930s, some feed and flour companies, including Gold Medal and Bemis Jason, had begun deliberately printing their sacks with attractive calico patterns and bright, solid colors. They understood what their customers were doing with the empty bags, and they adapted. A 50-pound flour sack, carefully washed and unpicked, could yield enough fabric for a child's dress. A 100-pound sack made a woman's blouse. Historians of American textile history have documented how some farm women became accomplished at color matching these sacks across multiple purchases, a kind of involuntary fabric shopping conducted through the contents of the bag rather than the bag itself. Home medical knowledge was equally essential. Calling a doctor was an expense most families postponed until the last possible moment. Women managed fevers with cold compresses, treated burns with homemade poultices, knew which herbs from the kitchen garden reduced inflammation and which helped a sleepless child rest. They were, out of necessity, the first and frequently the only line of healthcare their families had, and they practiced this role with a matter-of-factness that the generations that followed would find almost impossible to imagine. The food itself tells the most eloquent story of this knowledge. Depression-era cooking required a particular genius, the ability to make something tasteful and nourishing from almost nothing. Women developed dishes that stretched starches to their absolute limit. Bread puddings made from loaves too hard to slice. Cornmeal mush that could be cut cold and fried in drippings the following morning. Dried bean soups that simmered all day and fed an entire household for pennies. In parts of the American South, pot liquor, the mineral-rich liquid left behind after cooking collard greens or turnip tops with a piece of salt pork, was ladled out to children and elderly family members as a nourishing broth. Its nutritional value was instinctively understood and documented in community cookbooks long before it was confirmed scientifically. USAID extension bulletins of the Depression era included instructions for making yeast from potato water, the starchy, mineral-rich liquid left from boiling potatoes, so that bread could rise without purchased yeast. This piece of knowledge, once widely distributed and practiced, has since nearly vanished entirely from domestic life. These were not exotic techniques. They were ordinary life, invisible, taken entirely for granted, essential in the way that breathing is essential, not dramatic, simply necessary. But here is something that stops many people cold when they learn it. Many of these women, who mended by lamplight, rationed shoes and sugar, and fed families on the bones of one bird for an entire week, considered themselves not poor, but capable. The word they often refused was poor. The word they used was careful. And when prosperity finally arrived, that word began to sound like something else entirely. Chapter 3. A Silent Witness. This knowledge didn't just sit in kitchens, it sat beneath every crisis that the first half of the 20th century delivered. Quietly, without being named, the way a foundation sits beneath a house without being seen. When the stock market failed in 1929, women who already knew how to cook from a nearly empty larder possessed something crucial: the ability to begin Monday morning with essentially nothing and still put dinner on the table. For families with savings to lose, the Depression was a shock. For the families who had never had savings, who had always lived close to the edge, it was simply a sharpening of conditions they had always known. And they were, in a particular way, already prepared. When the Second World War brought formal rationing, when the Office of Price Administration issued ration books beginning in 1942, covering meat, butter, cooking oils, sugar, and canned goods, the adjustment required of middle-class families was genuinely disorienting. They were being asked to live on less than they were accustomed to. For many working-class women, however, the ration books simply put a government name on what had already been their daily reality. The math was familiar. The discipline was already there. The Victory Garden program, promoted aggressively by the federal government and taken up by millions of households across the country, produced results that astonished federal planners. Wartime estimates credited home and community gardens with supplying a remarkable proportion of the nation's fresh vegetables during peak conflict years. But the women who tended those gardens were not discovering something new. They had been growing beans along back fences and canning tomatoes in late August for as long as they could remember. The war simply made that habit visible and briefly celebrated. Community networks carried families through in ways that have since been largely forgotten. Church cookbooks, those modest, spiral-bound collections produced by women's auxiliaries and parish groups across the country, were not simply recipe collections. They were survival manuals encoded in domestic language, circulated hand-to-hand, recording the accumulated knowledge of entire communities about how to feed people on very little with dignity intact. Many of these books never made it into any archive. They were used until they fell apart. The same knowledge that stretched a Depression-era household through the 1930s stretched a wartime household through the 1940s. It was a steady, practiced, unannounced presence beneath the surface of American domestic life, through widowhood, through illness without insurance, through harvest failures, through the particular grief of waiting for news that didn't come. When a husband didn't come home from the war, or came home changed, a woman who understood the household mathematics of survival didn't need to be told what to do. She already knew. She had always known. But something happened in the decade after the war ended. Something very quiet. Not dramatic, not sudden, but irrevocable. The thread that had held this knowledge together, that mother-to-daughter line of transmission stretching back generations, began, in millions of families, to go slack. And by the time anyone noticed, the knowledge was already most of the way gone. Chapter 4. The Silence That Followed. Why did it stop? There is no single answer. History rarely gives us those, but the accounts left by women of the Depression and War generation, in memoirs, in oral histories collected by researchers over the following decades, in the letters and journals that have survived, suggest a convergence of reasons, each one human, each one understandable, and together amounting to something that looked, from the inside, entirely like love. The most frequently documented impulse was a mother's wish to protect her daughter from what she herself had endured. Women who had stretched a pound of flour across an entire week, who had mended the same pair of stockings until the stocking was more patch than stocking, who had sewn their children's Easter dresses from the cloth of feed sacks, often described their own frugality with a mixture of quiet pride and fierce, wordless shame. Not shame in themselves, exactly, but shame at the circumstances that had required it. The skills were so tightly bound up with hardship that it was difficult to separate one from the other. Teaching a daughter to render lard was, to some women, teaching her to remember what survival had looked like. And they didn't want their daughters to need to survive that way. Sociohistorians who have studied women's memoirs from this period note a consistent pattern. When the decision not to teach was conscious at all, mothers often framed it as a gift. You don't need to know this. Things are different now. We won't need this anymore. Post-war prosperity made that belief seem, for a time, entirely reasonable. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, had opened homeownership to a generation of working-class men who would never otherwise have qualified for mortgages. Suburbs grew with extraordinary speed. Between 1950 and 1960, American suburban population increased by nearly half. With those houses came something that had previously been a luxury: a modern kitchen, a full-size refrigerator, a gas or electric stove with reliable and consistent heat. The material conditions of domestic life changed so dramatically and so quickly that the old knowledge seemed to belong to a different world entirely, because, in many ways, it did. Advertising understood this before the women themselves did. The processed food industry, already powerful before the war, emerged in the post-war period with extraordinary momentum. Crisco, the hydrogenated vegetable shortening introduced by Procter & Gamble in 1911, had been marketed for decades as a modern and clean alternative to the lard that working women rendered at home. Now the pitch expanded across the entire kitchen. Canned goods, frozen dinners. Swanson's famous TV dinner appeared in 1953. Powdered mixes, store-bought bread sliced uniformly by machine. These were not simply marketed as convenient. They were presented, explicitly and relentlessly, as signs of a modern woman's freedom. A woman who bought a can of soup rather than making it from bones wasn't being lazy. She was participating in progress. She was showing that her family had arrived. Television amplified this message into every living room in the country in a way that no previous medium had managed. By the mid-1950s, the average American household was watching several hours of television daily, and a significant portion of that programming was advertising, much of it directed at women, and nearly all of it promoting the replacement of homemade with purchased. There is something almost unbearably poignant in this, understood from the distance of decades, because what those advertisements were really selling, and what many women understandably bought, was the idea that the knowledge their own mothers carried was no longer necessary. And if it wasn't necessary, then perhaps the suffering it represented wasn't necessary either. And that, perhaps, was what had been hardest to look at all along. Not every woman let it go. And in the households where the old habits quietly survived, practiced in private, rarely explained, almost never celebrated, something very different was being passed down. Not just techniques, something harder to name, and far more durable. Chapter 5. What changed? Before the war, a frugal, resourceful woman was admired. Her thrift a form of skill, her knowledge social currency. After the war, that measure flipped. By the mid-1950s, domestic worth was shown through what a woman could buy, not make. New appliances, convenience foods, a stocked fridge. Home economics classes shifted from teaching thrift to teaching consumption. Installment credit spread, and the old fear of debt loosened. Frugality became faintly embarrassing, linked to the old country, the old hardship the past people were eager to outrun. The knowledge didn't vanish because it was worthless. It vanished because it became a symbol of everything people wanted to leave behind. Chapter 6. Why some women kept it anyway. Some women kept the old habits, saving drippings, turning sheet sides to middle, simmering the chicken carcass into stock, quietly, without explanation. Some hadn't been reached by the new prosperity, but others, with good jobs and modern kitchens, kept doing it anyway. For them it wasn't about need anymore. It was ritual, identity, a thread to the women before them, who'd survived on nothing and never been thanked for it. Stopping would have felt like letting those women be forgotten. Why did a generation stop teaching daughters these skills? No single moment caused it. Just a slow pull between what mothers wanted to spare their daughters and what culture told them to want instead. There was shame, hope, and love in it, and the love and the loss were often the same thing. What was lost wasn't just technique, it was a form of transmission, a wordless inheritance passed hand to hand in a kitchen. Unlike silver or land, that kind of knowledge can be quietly left behind. The real question now may not be why it was lost, but what we'd find if we went looking for it again.